Welcome to Spiritual Reality. My name is Mr. Kirkendall. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor. Today, we're going to begin to discuss something that affects a large part of our population, and this is people who suffer from anxiety disorders. Now, before we really get into how to overcome it and how to treat it and how to deal with it and what we probably should and shouldn't be doing, is first we need to understand that anxiety itself is an evolutionary function. In other words, it's necessary for us to have some forms of anxiety. Okay. For example, when we evolved, mostly we were living out in the wild. We were, agrarian people, but we grew up. We were in a lot of danger, right? I mean, 10,000 years ago, you could have been eaten by a saber-toothed cat. Now, in order for us to survive, adapt, and evolve, we had to have a certain anxiety about certain things, right? So if you don't have any anxiety about being eaten by the saber-toothed cat, chances are you're going to get ate by the saber-toothed cat. So having a certain amount of anxiety is normal and necessary for our survival. Now, the problem is when the anxiety becomes so elevated or gets so far out of control that you can't live a normal daily life. It begins to affect the daily normal things you need to do. Like, for example, you don't want to leave the house. You can't stand up in front of a crowd. You're afraid to drive a car, right? Or you're afraid to be in a relationship with someone because of past abuse and that sort of thing. So these are the types of things that we want to look at when anxiety has gotten out of control. But and then it also can be situational. Sometimes it may seem like we have an anxiety disorder when you're just adapting to a certain circumstance that you're in. For example, let's say you're from the west or south side of Chicago and you carry a gun. You are constantly looking over your shoulder. You constantly think that something is going to happen to you or take place, and someone might look at you and say, "Well, this person has an anxiety disorder," but it's not really a disorder because it's not out of bounds with the circumstances that you're in. In other words, if you live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of burglaries, you don't really have anxiety because that's if you're trying to take precautions for that. It's anxiety, but it's not an anxiety disorder. So we got to kind of learn how to learn the difference. If you have a history of, say, breast cancer in your family, or a history of heart disease, and you are taking all kinds of precautions so that you don't develop those diseases again, it's anxiety that you should have, but it's not an anxiety disorder. Taking certain actions. We should all have anxiety about certain things like, I don't know, like killing someone, right? That shouldn't be something that you do without some form of anxiety. So when we talk about having anxiety, people say, well, I have anxiety. Well, everybody does, or you should, right? A person with no anxiety is generally going to be probably closer to maybe a sociopath, because that means things that you should kind of have anxiety about doing, you no longer have anxiety about. Like I said before, like committing murder, robbing a bank, embezzlement, all these different types of things where we get ready to do something, we say, oh, God, I really shouldn't do that because I'm going to get caught, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. Well, if that anxiety doesn't exist, then you're not going to have a problem doing those things. So we want to have a difference between, understand the difference between someone just having a normal level of anxiety and having an anxiety disorder. Now, When we have an anxiety disorder, now we've reached a point where we can't function either in our daily lives or in certain situations. Uh, for example, you can't get in a car and drive, okay, because you are too afraid. You can't do that. Now, that's going to affect your daily life. That means you have an actual disorder, right? Or you are afraid to leave your house. Once again, that means that your anxiety levels are so high that it's affecting your daily living. You can't stand up in front of a crowd and speak. You're afraid to get on airplanes. Okay, there's a lot of things that we have anxiety about. Some of them are specific anxieties, meaning you're afraid of heights, you're afraid of driving, you're afraid of social situations, and then there's general anxiety. It means you just worry about every single thing. You're worried about your son, you're worried about your daughter, you're worried about your mama, you're worried about your grandmama, you're worried about work, you're worried about the crime in the community. You just worry about everything. That's a generalized anxiety. Now, we all worry about stuff. I mean, we worry about our bills, we worry about our kids being successful, we worry about our parents being sick or ill or whatever. So we all do worry. What a disorder is the opposite of order, right? So when we say someone has a disorder, that means whatever they're dealing with is no longer orderly, and it's out of control. It's affecting something that it shouldn't affect. So before you say, okay, I have an anxiety disorder, let's ask the question: do you actually have a disorder, or is it just the normal anxiety that you're supposed to have, in your life? Now, one of the ways people treat anxiety, particularly psychiatrists, they're going to prescribe medication. One of the most popular form of medications are benzodiazepines. Usually the most popular is Xanax. Now, it will take away your feelings of anxiety temporarily, but it's also very addictive. But understand, that in itself gives you a problem. When you're treating anxiety with medication, okay, the medication doesn't know how to differentiate, okay, between what the normal anxiety that we all need as human beings to have and the elevated anxiety that's causing the disorder, right? It just numbs the anxiety. So, in fact, and it does so in a way whereas the brain, after a while, will not function properly because it's gotten used to the medication doing certain things. So all of a sudden, and this is particularly true with benzodiazepines, which is why they're addictive, all of a sudden, you don't have the ability, or at least your brain doesn't have the ability to do things that it used to be able to do. So now you're going to have a whole lot of anxiety when you're no longer on that drug. All right, so that's kind of the dangers of treating anxiety with medication. Now it does work. Like I said, it's gonna at least some of it do. At least the benzodiazepines do. They're gonna squash the anxiety. There's no way around it. But then you're gonna develop a tolerance to it, so you're gonna need higher doses at some point. But then also when you know it's addictive, and then when you're no longer on those drugs, right, your anxiety is going to be a lot worse and a lot elevated, and the fact that it can't differentiate, right? In other words, it can't balance you out to a normal level of anxiety that we're supposed to have, right? It could take away most anxiety, or all anxiety. So some of the things that you might normally not do because of your anxiety, for example, suicide. Most people, particularly religious people, are not going to commit suicide. Why? Because there's a lot of anxiety about that. I mean, it's usually a point where if I kill myself, there's no coming back. Now, but if I'm taking something that will pretty much get rid of that anxiety about doing that, then the chances of me doing it has become elevated. But the same thing, another substance that will take away anxiety is heroin. Heroin will pretty much make you feel nothing. I mean, it will get rid of your anxiety. Okay, but again, it's the after effects of trying to treat it with heroin is going to just obviously destroy your life. But if you're taking it, while you're taking it, no, you're not going to have any anxiety. Guarantee you that. Now, what is an anxiety disorder, and why do we have it? A lot of times, anxiety is like fear, but it's a little bit different than fear, because it's like a combination of evolutionary response and irrational fear, kind of, but it's elevated. So, because fear is healthy as well as anxiety. Fear is gonna like stop you from doing things you shouldn't do. Anxiety, on the other hand, is very elevated. Now, generally, when we have some form of anxiety, it's based on trauma, personal experience, or just our general knowledge about something. Okay? Generally, if you don't have experience with something or trauma with something, you can still have anxiety, but you probably won't, unless it's something unknown. So we definitely have anxiety about things a lot of times that are unknown and that could potentially be dangerous, but we don't know the landscape of it. We definitely will have some anxiety about things knowledge that we have. Case in point, perfect example of not knowing the danger of something or not having anxiety or something. If you have a 2 or 3-year-old or even a pet, right, or even like a dog or something, right? One of the things we do when we have a 2-year-old is we try to hold their hand. We try to stop them from running out in the street, right? Because the 2-year-old doesn't know. They don't understand that, hey, if I get hit by this car, that's going to be very dangerous. They haven't developed that knowledge yet. Same thing with maybe a dog. A dog is more example. You see a lot of times, a cat's generally at some point will learn that, but that's after trial and error, right? Generally, I've seen like a cat will see a car coming and they'll just run real fast, right? Because trial and error. They understand now, wait a minute, this big thing is bailing at me. I need to get out of the way. So there's knowledge at that now. So they have a heightened level of anxiety. If your dog sees somebody coming to the house, okay, again, he's going to start barking or she's going to start barking. That's a level of anxiety. But that's evolutionary. It's not necessarily based on knowledge, right? So a lot of times when we learn things, right, things that we didn't know previously, now we have a level of anxiety, right? It goes back. I don't know if anybody remember. I don't know how many people listening to this were alive back in, say, 1979, 1980, when they first discovered, like, the AIDS virus, okay? And a few years later, all of a sudden, they found out that condoms can prevent the spread of AIDS, of HIV, which leads to the AIDS virus. So after that, there was this whole campaign about safe sex, and it's still out there, right? I remember when I was in the military, they would literally hand you condoms when you went off post, right? Because now, was that overreacting? No, because this disease was killing people. But once we had knowledge that the disease existed, a healthy level of anxiety came about so that we were able to deal with it appropriately. Now, here is when it become a disorder. If you just stop engaging in sexual activity altogether, right? You can't have a healthy relationship, period, because you're so afraid of this disorder or this disease. Then it can become a problem. Let's say you go out the house and you get mugged, right? Or you get robbed. So now you get a concealed carry license. Now you carry a gun, right? That's a healthy level of anxiety because, hey, you've been robbed already. You know it's a possibility. So you're gonna, take some precautions. Nothing wrong with that. But you get robbed and now you can't leave the house anymore, right? You don't even want to look out. You look out the window all the time. You're thinking everybody that's walking past your house is trying to break in, trying to rob you, and all that. So now you have become completely paranoid. That is a disorder. Okay, that means now it's affecting the way you live. So how then do we treat that? Well, treating anxiety is sort of like there's specific ways to do it, particularly with phobias. Right? A phobia is a form of anxiety. It's a specific anxiety, like people who are afraid of heights, people who are claustrophobic, people who have fears of driving. A couple ways they do that with what we call desensitized systematic desensitization. That means, or flooding in some cases. That means you repeatedly expose a person to that which they are afraid of, but without the consequence which they're afraid of getting from being exposed to that. So, for example, if you're a person that's afraid to leave the house, right? What I would do is I would probably go to their house from a therapeutic standpoint, and we would just go for a walk, right? We would maybe start out from a block, then maybe 2 blocks and 3 blocks. We would walk together. Then we would begin having this person go out by themselves, right? Maybe sit on the porch, maybe walk again, and continue to do so, and you would keep flooding or trying to desensitize them to the fear, okay, so that they can get a little bit better. Because one of the things that that causes the anxiety is you feel a loss of control, a loss of power. One of the things human beings have a need for, we need to control our circumstances and situations. So when you feel like there's a loss of control and a loss of power, right, that can elevate your anxiety. One of the things, this is the difference between our normal anxiety that we have that we should have, right, to get through life. Because generally we feel we can control the situation, right? We have a certain amount of control over the situation, right? When we have that anxiety disorder, usually we feel we don't have control, right? That my actions are not going to prevent this outcome that I'm expecting to get. That can become a problem. That can become very, very disruptive. If we feel that no matter what we do, there's no way we can prevent or control the situation, then yes, we will ultimately develop an anxiety disorder. And these anxiety disorders can lead to many other disorders. They can lead to panic attacks. They can lead to panic disorders, right? Because now all of a sudden, let's say your anxiety, and that's really all a panic attack is. Your anxiety levels get so high that now you can't breathe. Your heart is beating real fast, and all of. They might even feel like a heart attack. And we get these and we have these fears and anxieties in all kinds of situations. I know a person that would go through panic attacks when they took a test, right? And this person that study all day long, study all night long, but when that test came, bam, they couldn't do it. Very intelligent person, but could not take a test. And so one of the great causes of this anxiety is that feeling that we have lost control over our lives and lost control over our outcomes. Other forms of anxiety, Julie, one of the most prevalent forms that we don't discuss a lot. We discuss it a lot when we're dealing with people who've been in the military, but that is post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder. Now, they're different in the sense that acute stress disorder is when you're having extreme anxiety over a recent trauma, meaning within the last 30 days. Maybe somebody got killed, maybe you got into a car accident, maybe you were raped, molested, whatever. post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning that you're having problems with a certain level of stress or certain trauma long after it's taken place, probably more than 30 days, 6 months, a year after it's already taken place. So, in fact, there are many people, far more people in society than we realize, that suffer from post traumatic stress. Far more people. For example, we always look at it like, again, we generally associate it with soldiers because obviously war is an extreme situation. But a lot of gang members suffer from post-traumatic stress, right? Because their lifestyle is similar to that of soldiers. But also, trauma doesn't have to be something that's very blunt. In other words, it doesn't have to be something as extreme as somebody being killed. Trauma can mean you can be traumatized by being rejected or by being bullied or having someone you really cared about breaking your heart. You think about, and it may manifest itself in different ways. There are a lot of police officers and judges and teachers, even, that are in their position and they're traumatized, and they do their jobs based on that trauma. For example, if you're a judge and you were bullied in school, or if you were a police officer, you were bullied in school, or even teachers, bullying causes trauma. Or you were rejected and your heart was broken. On certain types of students because of the same thing. Now they may not be doing this because of that, at least knowingly doing it or doing it on purpose, but they are doing it. And so one of the things you want to be able to do is to recognize that, right? Recognize if I'm suffering from some kind of trauma. I was traumatized at some point in my life. If you were traumatized at some point in your life, stop and ask yourself, are you making decisions based on that trauma? Now, sometimes these decisions may be rational. Sometimes they could be very irrational. For example, if your house was broken into and you got a gun in the security system, that's rational, right? But if your house was broken into and all of a sudden you start setting up booby traps, you get an arsenal of weapons, and you start doing all, and all your money is going towards securing your house, now you're being irrational, right? Well, the same thing goes if you're in a position of authority. And this also goes with some politicians, some, people who become in a position of authority, but they were traumatized in a certain way, right? Maybe someone in your family OD'd, right? And now you're in a position to really do something about drugs, right? So anyone who you can't come in your courtroom or your police officer, anybody that you see with drugs, you're going to really try to slam them and throw the book at them, right? Well, now that becomes a disorder, right? And you may have PTSD without really realizing it, because if it's still affecting your life if a trauma is still affecting your life years later, right? You still have nightmares about it. You still think about it all the time. It's affecting your daily living in some kind of way, or affecting your decisions. It could very well be post-traumatic stress, which is another form of anxiety. So, something you want to look into, right? Because when it becomes a part of your life and you can't make rational decisions because you're dealing with some kind of trauma or you're dealing with some kind of anxiety, that's when you need help. Now, we talked earlier about trying to treat it with medication. We also talked about flooding and desensitization. But the number one thing about anxiety is that fear of the unknown and that loss of control. Anytime we feel like we have lost control of our lives, that's when it becomes a disorder, right? I don't have control over my life anymore, no matter what I do. So one of the things at least I try to focus on in treatment is how do you get your power back? Now, if you are a person who was, I don't know, raped, let's just, for example, the woman that was raped or a person that was molested as a kid. Okay, one of the things that are giving you this trauma is your power's been taken away. Your right of self determination has been taken away, particularly rape. Rape is one of those things that really takes away your right to self determination. You want to determine who you are intimate with, right? As a human being, that's something that you want to determine. So when somebody rapes you, your right to self determination has really been taken away. So one of the things is you want to be able to do. How do I get this back? How do I get back what was taken from me? Because one thing we have to understand is this: we don't have time machines, so there's no way we're ever going to be able to go back and undo anything that happened to us or anything that we've done. And some people are actually traumatized by and have anxiety because of things that they've done. Particularly people who have lived a criminal lifestyle. You know, they've done a lot of pretty bad things, and they have nightmares about that. You know, so it doesn't necessarily have to be because of something that was done to you. It could be because of something you've done. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. You can't undo it. Once it's done, it's done. What's done is done. So, how do we then get over it and get past it? Now, we've talked about a few ways, but one of the number one things, particularly when anxiety is caused by a person that you might have trusted, or caused by anybody, or something that you've done. A key component of that is to let it go. Very difficult for us to do, right? When somebody has harmed us, right? And let's say they harmed us 20 years ago. Maybe they've done their time, whatever the case might be. A lot of times we won't let it go. Letting it go doesn't mean you still have to have a relationship with this person or that y'all have to be cool. It just means that you have to stop carrying that burden around. Because a lot of our extreme anxiety disorders are really misplaced. Consider this. If you take the number of people, say in a city like Chicago, a city of 3 million people, within that time, probably 1 trillion times a day, people come in contact with each other. And of that 1 trillion times, only a few hundred times do people actually harm each other. So when you look at the chances that people have to harm each other, and you look at the number of times that people actually do harm each other, it's a very, very small percentage. Not even 1/1000th of 1%. When you look at all the opportunities that people have to harm each other when they come in contact. One of the reasons why we have so much anxiety is because we hear about this stuff all the time. And we have a lot more anxiety now that we have social media, you have 24-hour-a-day news channels, and all this kind of stuff. So we're constantly hearing bad news all day, every day. So that's going to heighten our level of anxiety. When in fact, even if someone was raped in their life, think about it. Let's say you're 35 years old and you were raped once. You know, all the days of your life you went without something that horrific happening to you. Then it happens that one time and it disrupts your entire life. Which means that now that person, as long as that's disrupting your life, that person is raping you every day. And that's something we don't understand about letting someone else take your power away. If you were robbed, raped, abused, bullied, whatever, as long as that part is controlling your life, as long as it's determining your outcome, as long as it's dictating to you how you behave and the choices that you make, that person's still doing it to you, right? they're still molesting you. They're still raping you. They're still bullying you. They're still, whatever it is that's causing you to have this trauma, whatever it is that's causing you to have this anxiety, they're still doing it to you. So, one of the ways, again, with these specific types of anxieties, is you have to free yourself and you have to re-obtain your power. That's not always an easy thing to do, but it is certainly a necessary thing to do if you want to improve and get better. So, how do you do that? Well, obtaining your power is going to be different for everybody in every situation. Because one of the things about going about our daily lives is we like to do things that we actually have control over. Right? And so it's hard to go about your daily life when you feel like your life is completely out of control. And that's what anxiety does. Okay? So one of the things we do is we have to learn, and this is going to be a whole nother video on this, but we're going to touch on it right now. One of the things we do is we have to learn what we actually have control over. Okay? Once we learn that, then that's what we take control of. Okay? In other words, there's no way you're going to change the heart and mind of someone who's going to commit armed robbery or someone who's going to be a rapist or something like that. But there are certain things you can control, right? That can actually improve the outcome of that situation. Because remember, one of the things we have to understand about things that happen to us in our lives is that they're going to happen. Certain things are going to happen to you regardless, right? It's just baked into the cake. It's just built in, right? We're gonna lose loved ones. We're gonna lose jobs. Somebody's gonna try to bully us. Somebody's gonna lie on us. All these different things in life are gonna take place. So it's essentially the way we deal with it that's going to determine the outcome. In other words, when these things happen and we feel like our power has been taken away, that is when we end up with a high level of anxiety and it becomes a disorder. Now, going back to the evolutionary response, that's a basic level of anxiety that we should have, right? You need to stay away from the saber-toothed cat. Okay, so think about that in life. Staying away from the saber-toothed cat is the same as not running out in the middle of the street and getting hit by a car, right? It's the same thing as or not sticking your hand in the fire, right? Basic level of safety that we need. So we need that basic level of anxiety. However, right, when it gets to a point so bad that whereas you're so afraid of fire that you refuse to turn on the stove and cook your food, that's when it becomes a problem. So, and that problem stems from, again, a loss of control, because you feel like, doesn't matter if I just stand by here at the stove and I watch it, I follow all the instructions, I do everything I'm supposed to do, our house still gonna burn down because I don't have control over the situation. Okay, so getting back our control, and again, there's no one clear method to do that. That's going to be different for everybody because everybody's circumstance is different, right? And circumstances oftentimes will determine how we think and feel and how we behave. So, since everybody's circumstance is a little bit different, it's going to be difficult to say, okay, just do this, and that'll get you back your power. No. The key is you need to understand that you feel like your power has been lost. Now, once you understand that, you feel like your power has been lost, then it's up to you now to figure out, okay, how do I get that power back? And that's going to be different. Because now, for example, you're afraid to drive. That means because you feel like there's no control. If I'm driving this car, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm going to get into a car wreck and die. Okay, so that means now you have to figure out, okay, how do I get that power back? And it's gonna be different ways to do that. Okay, so the several ways you're going to treat anxiety. One, obviously, the quickest is going to be through medication. However, that's temporary, and in the end, it's probably not going to work very well. Okay, because the underlying issue of the anxiety is still going to be there. But it's something to definitely look into. Okay, now the second, obviously, flooding, desensitization. These are more for specific types of anxiety or specific phobias, right? Things like claustrophobia, fear of heights, even fear of driving or social phobias and stuff like that. In other words, you start somebody, they have a social phobia, you start them out speaking in front of a smaller crowd, and then you gradually, build the crowd up until they become comfortable with it. That's pretty much all that is. The generalized anxieties is a little bit more complicated because that's something that you just have anxiety about your entire life. PTSD is a little bit more complicated because what you fear has already happened, right? And that makes a difference. If you watch somebody get ate by the saber-toothed cat, right? That creates a trauma. That's different now because it's not just something you're concerned about, right? You've already seen it happen. Okay, or let's say you get attacked by the cat, but you escape, right? Well, now you know it can happen, so now that can create a trauma, right? Again, so we can't use flooding or systematic desensitization, right? When for a trauma, right? Because so we can't keep exposing you to the cat, right? We know the cat is going to eat you. We can't do that, okay? Well, we then have to be able to get you to understand that you have to re-empower yourself, and we have to understand that the chances of you getting attacked by the cat again are going to be very low. But we have to take precautions that you don't get attacked by the cat again. But then we have to teach you how to live your daily life despite the dangers of the cat. That's one of the keys to getting your power back and understanding the treatment mechanism of it. You have to understand that life is seriously unsafe. Okay, it just is. There's no way to ever protect ourselves against every possible thing that can take place. It's just not possible. So one of the things we have to learn how to do is be able to navigate life despite its dangers and take precautions so that we can, minimize the likelihood that we're going to encounter these dangers. Not eliminate, just minimize it. Okay, now these are some of the things that we can use to help treat anxiety. I am Hiram Kirkendall. This is the Hiram Kirkendall Show. And please do not forget to grab a copy of my book, Soul Sessions, Spiritual and Reality Counseling for Becoming the Best Version of Yourself, available in both hard copy and ebook on Amazon.com. Okay, thank you all so much for listening. Hope you got something out of it, and we will see you next time.